The ship appeared without warning on a Tuesday morning in March, and it was larger than anything humanity had ever built or imagined. It hung above the Pacific Ocean like a wound in the sky, blocking the sun and casting a shadow that stretched across 3 continents. And when people looked up, they felt something ancient stir in their bones, the primal fear of something bigger and older, and hungrier than themselves. The Concord of Voices had watched humanity for centuries, ever since the first radio signals leaked out into the void like blood in water. And they had studied these strange creatures with their short lives and shorter memories. These beings who killed each other over invisible lines in the dirt and worshipped gods they could not see. The 17 elder species of the Concord had ruled the galaxy for longer than humanity had existed. And they had a system that worked beautifully in its simplicity. Find young species, terrify them, and offer them a choice between submission and extinction. It had worked 47 times before Ambassador Vethkai stood in the center of his vessel's communication chamber, his crystalline body catching the light and scattering it into rainbows that meant nothing to him. And he prepared to deliver the message that had broken the spirit of countless worlds, his voice broadcast across every screen and speaker on Earth, translated instantly into every human language. And it carried the weight of 10,000 years of galactic dominance. Species designated human, he began, his tone as flat and cold as the void between stars. You have been observed and evaluated by the Concord of Voices, and your fate has been decided in accordance with the laws that govern all emerging civilizations. In New York and Tokyo and Lagos and Sao Paulo, people stopped in the streets and stared at screens, their faces pale and their hands trembling, and the world held its breath. You will surrender all faster-than-light-capable vessels to Concord authorities within 30 planetary rotations, and you will accept designation as a client species under the protection and governance of the Concord, and you will provide tribute in the form of resources and labor as determined by your assigned overseer. Vethkai paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the planet like a funeral shroud. Failure to comply will result in systematic extinction, as has been demonstrated to 47 previous species who chose unwisely, and your world will be sterilized and repurposed for more cooperative inhabitants. The transmission ended, and for a long moment, the Earth was silent in the United Nations headquarters in Geneva. The emergency session had already begun, and representatives from every nation sat in stunned silence as the reality of their situation sank into their minds like poison into water. They were not alone in the universe, and the universe wanted them to kneel. Secretary General Amar Okonkwo sat at the head of the assembly, her dark eyes moving across the faces of the most powerful people on Earth, and she saw fear in every single one of them. The Russian delegate was pale and sweating, his hands shaking as he reached for a glass of water that he could not bring himself to drink. The American representative had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. Her confident posture collapsed into something small and defeated. The Chinese delegate stared at nothing, his mind clearly racing through calculations that all ended in the same terrible answer. We must consider their offer, the French delegate said, his voice cracking on every word. Because we cannot fight them, and we cannot hide from them, and we cannot run from them. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber, and Okonkwo watched as humanity's leaders prepared to do what leaders had done throughout history, surrender their people to save themselves. But something stirred in her chest, something hot and fierce and utterly unreasonable. And she thought of her grandmother who had survived a genocide, and her father who had fought in 3 wars, and her daughter who dreamed of touching the stars. She thought of Mumbai, where 40 million people were waking up to the same sky as everyone else, not knowing that their city had already been selected as an example. She thought of every human who had ever refused to bow, from the slaves who sang in the fields to the soldiers who charged into certain death. From the protesters who faced down tanks to the scientists who reached for the impossible, as she made a decision that would change the galaxy forever. "No," she said. And her voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the chamber. The delegates turned to look at her, confusion and fear mixing in their eyes. "Madame Secretary General," the British delegate said carefully, "I do not think you understand the situation we face. Because these beings have technology we cannot comprehend and power we cannot match." Okonkwo stood, and something in her bearing made even the most powerful people in the room fall silent. "I understand perfectly," she said. "And I understand that they have done this 47 times before. And I understand that every single species they conquered made the same calculation you are making now, that survival through submission is better than death through defiance." She walked to the window and looked up at the massive ship that hung in the sky like a god, demanding worship. "But I also understand something else. Something that perhaps those other species did not understand, and it is this. If we kneel now, we will kneel forever, and our children will kneel. And their children will kneel, and everything that makes us human will be worn away, until we are nothing but servants who have forgotten what it meant to stand." She turned back to face the assembly, and her eyes burned with something that the Concord psychologists had never accounted for in their calculations. They expect us to be afraid. And we are afraid, because only fools face extinction without fear. But fear is not the same as surrender, and terror is not the same as submission. Her voice rose, filling the chamber with the sound of human defiance. "I say we tell them no. And I say we tell them that Earth is not for sale, and humanity is not for breaking. And if they want to destroy us, then they will have to work for every single inch." The chamber erupted into chaos. Voices shouting and arguing and pleading. But Okonkwo stood firm in the center of the storm, and when the vote was finally called, humanity chose defiance by a margin of 7 votes. Ambassador Vethkai received Earth's response exactly 29 rotations and 23 hours after his ultimatum. And when his translation matrices confirmed that the word was indeed no, his crystalline form flickered with something he had not felt in millennia. He felt surprised in 10,000 years. No species had ever simply refused. The Concord's response came exactly 1 hour after humanity's refusal. And it came in the form of light. A beam of energy descended from the massive ship above the Pacific. A column of pure destruction that moved across the ocean at impossible speed. And it struck Mumbai at exactly 3:47 p.m. local time on a Wednesday afternoon when the streets were full of people living their ordinary lives. 40 million souls vanished in an instant, transformed into ash and memory and rage. The pillar of light was visible from space, a wound in the earth that glowed white-hot for 3 days. And when it finally faded, there was nothing left but glass and silence where a great city had once stood. Ambassador Vethkai broadcast his second message to the planet, and his voice carried the same flat certainty it had always carried. "This demonstration was necessary to correct your misunderstanding of the situation," he said. "And you now have 24 hours to reconsider your response before we select the next population center for correction." The Concord's War Council watched Earth through their observation drones, waiting for the familiar pattern to emerge: the weeping leaders, the terrified populations demanding surrender, the inevitable collapse of courage in the face of overwhelming power. They had seen it 47 times before, and they knew exactly what to expect. But what they saw instead made them question everything they thought they understood about young species. The Earth went silent, not the silence of defeat, not the silence of a broken species preparing to beg for mercy, but something else entirely, a silence that felt like the moment before a thunderstorm. Heavy and electric and dangerous in Washington and Beijing and Moscow and New Delhi. Leaders who had been ready to surrender the day before sat in their bunkers and watched the footage from Mumbai play over and over again on their screens. They watched children turn to ash. And they watched families erase from existence. And they watched 40 million lives end in a single flash of alien arrogance, and something changed in them. Something fundamental and irreversible within 6 hours. The President of the United States dissolved the American military and transferred all assets to a new organization called the United Earth Defense Force within 12 hours. China and Russia and every other major power had done the same within 24 hours. Humanity had done something it had never done in its entire history. It had stopped fighting itself and started fighting. Together, Admiral Chen Wei was 63 years old when he received command of Earth's combined fleet, and he had spent his entire life preparing for wars that now seemed absurdly small and pointless. He stood on the bridge of the newly commissioned used Defiance, looking out at a fleet of ships that had been built by enemies who were now brothers. And he addressed his officers with words that would be remembered for centuries. "They think they have broken us," he said, his voice steady despite the grief that burned in his chest. "And they think that Mumbai was a demonstration of their power. But they are wrong about what they have demonstrated." He pulled up an image of the crater where Mumbai had once stood, and every officer in the room felt their hands clench into fists. "They have demonstrated that they will kill our children to make us afraid. And they have demonstrated that surrender will not save us from their cruelty. And they have demonstrated that the only choice we truly have is between dying on our knees and dying on our feet." He turned to face his officers directly, and his eyes held something that the Concord psychologists had never seen in their conquered species. Not fear, not despair, but cold and calculating fury. "Every soul in Mumbai just enlisted in our navy," he said. "And we will carry them with us into every battle. And we will make the Concord pay for every single life in blood and fire and broken ships." The first human counterattack launched 3 days after Mumbai. A desperate assault on a Concord supply station in the outer reaches of the solar system. Everyone knew it was a suicide mission. And everyone knew that the 50 pilots who volunteered would not be coming home. And everyone knew that it would change nothing about the balance of power between humanity and the Concord. But they went anyway. Lieutenant Sarah Chun was 24 years old when she climbed into the cockpit of her fighter. And she had lost her parents and her brother in her childhood home in Mumbai. She was not fighting to win. And she was not fighting because she thought she could survive. She was fighting because the alternative was to do nothing. And doing nothing felt worse than death. The battle lasted exactly 17 minutes, and when it was over, 43 human pilots were dead, and the Concord supply station was an expanding cloud of debris. The Concord commanders reviewed the footage with growing unease, analyzing every moment of the battle to understand what they had witnessed. The human pilots had fought without regard for their own survival, throwing themselves at enemy ships in ways that made no tactical sense. And when their weapons ran dry, they had used their own vessels as missiles. But the thing that disturbed the Concord most was not the tactics or the ferocity. It was the faces of the human pilots in the moments before they died. They were smiling. This is not normal behavior for a young species facing extinction, the Concords chief strategist reported to the War Council. And our psychological models did not predict this response. And I recommend we increase our analysis of human behavior before proceeding. Ambassador Vethkai dismissed the concerns with a wave of his crystalline hand. They are simply displaying the irrational courage that young species sometimes show before accepting the inevitable, he said. And once we destroy a few more of their cities, they will remember that they are afraid. But deep in the part of his consciousness that he rarely acknowledged, Vethkai felt something he had not experienced in 10,000 years. He felt uncertain across Earth. Recruitment centers were overwhelmed with volunteers. Not drafted soldiers, not conscripted warriors, but ordinary people who had looked at Mumbai and decided that they would rather die fighting than live as slaves. Factories that had built cars began building warships, and laboratories that had studied medicine began studying weapons, and schools that had taught children about art and history began teaching them about tactics and survival. Humanity was transforming itself into something new, something that had never existed before in the galaxy, a species that had chosen war not out of hope for victory, but out of pure, stubborn, magnificent spite. And in the ashes of Mumbai, the first memorial was already being planned, not a monument to the dead, but a monument to the choice that humanity had made when faced with extinction. The inscription would be simple, carved in stone that would last for millennia. They tried to make us kneel, and we chose to stand. 3 years into the war, the Concorde's greatest strategist sat alone in his chamber and stared at numbers that made no sense. The being known as the Calculation had earned his name through 10,000 years of perfect predictions, and his models had guided the Concorde through 47 successful conquests, without a single significant error. But humanity had broken his models completely. They should have surrendered after Mumbai, he muttered to himself, his 6 eyes scanning the data for the 100th time. And they should have collapsed after we destroyed their colonies on Mars. And they should have begged for mercy after we killed their first fleet at Jupiter. He pulled up another simulation, adjusting the variables to account for human behavior, and watched it play out to its inevitable conclusion. According to every calculation, humanity should have surrendered 2 years and 7 months ago, he said. And yet they continue to fight, and they continue to die, and they continue to cost us resources that we cannot afford to lose. The door to his chamber opened, and Ambassador Vethkai entered with the heavy steps of a being who had not slept in far too long. We have lost another supply convoy, Vethkai said, his crystalline form flickering with exhaustion. And the humans used a new tactic that we did not anticipate. They hid soldiers inside asteroid debris and waited for 3 weeks without food or water until our ships passed close enough to attack. The Calculation processed this information and felt something that he could only describe as frustration. That is not rational behavior, he said, because those soldiers had no extraction plan and no chance of survival. And they knew when they volunteered that they were choosing certain death. Vethkai made a sound that might have been a laugh if his species was capable of such a thing. I have stopped trying to understand their rationality, he said, because they do not seem to possess any, and every time I think I understand them, they do something that defies all logic. He pulled up a recording and played it for the Calculation. The footage showed a human pilot named Captain Yuki Tanaka leading a squadron of 50 fighters against a Concorde dreadnought, one of the most powerful vessels in the fleet, armed with enough weapons to destroy a small moon. She knew she could not win, Vethkai said, and her weapons could not penetrate our shields, and her ships were outmatched in every possible way. The footage showed Tanaka's squadron being destroyed one by one, their small fighters bursting into flame against the dreadnought's defenses. But she did not retreat, Vethkai continued. And when her weapons ran out, she flew her ship directly into our vessel's main engine, and she overloaded her reactor at the moment of impact. The explosion that followed tore through the dreadnought's hull like paper, and the massive ship broke apart in a cascade of secondary explosions. Her last transmission was audio only, Vethkai said, and he played it for the Calculation. The sound that filled the chamber was unmistakable. It was laughter, pure and genuine and utterly defiant. The sound of a human being who had chosen her death and found joy in the choosing. The Calculation felt something cold crawl through his consciousness. This is not warfare, he said slowly, because warfare requires the possibility of victory. And these humans fight without any expectation of winning. Then what is it? Beth K. asked. The calculation searched his vast database for an appropriate term and found only one word that fit: spite. He said, because they are not fighting to win, they are fighting to hurt us. And they are fighting to make us pay for every victory with blood and resources and time. On a distant planet called Kepler 442b, a human soldier named Private Marcus Williams was proving the calculations analysis correct. He had been part of a garrison defending a small colony when the Concord forces arrived. And when the evacuation order came, he had volunteered to stay behind and hold the mountain pass that led to the colony's only spaceport. How long do you need? He had asked his commanding officer. 6 hours, she had replied. And I am sorry, Marcus, because we cannot send reinforcements. And you will be alone. He had smiled at her then. A smile that she would remember for the rest of her life. 6 hours is nothing, he said, and I have been alone before. And I am very good at being stubborn. He held that pass for 19 hours, 3,000. Concord soldiers threw themselves at his position, and he killed them with rifles and grenades and knives and rocks and his bare hands when everything else ran out. When reinforcements finally arrived the next day, they found him dead at his post, his body broken but his position unbreached. And around him lay the bodies of more than 200 enemy soldiers. He had carved a message into the rock before he died, using his combat knife and the last of his strength. And the message read, "Make them pay for every inch." That message spread across humanity like wildfire, carved into ships and tattooed on skin and whispered like a prayer before every battle. Make them pay for every inch. The Concord had never faced an enemy like this. An enemy that measured victory not in territory gained or enemies defeated, but in cost inflicted and pain delivered. When the Concord destroyed a human colony on Proxima Centauri, humanity responded by spending 2 years and 10,000 lives to drag an asteroid into the orbital path of a Concord agricultural world. Asteroid impact ruined the planet's harvest for a decade and caused a famine that killed millions of Concord citizens. When the Concord assassinated Earth's entire military leadership in a single coordinated strike, humanity responded by developing a new command structure that had no single point of failure, and by releasing the names and locations of every Concord leader to the human information network known as the Internet. Within a month, 3 Concord admirals had been killed by human assassins who had traveled across the galaxy with nothing but a knife and a willingness to die. The calculation ran his simulations again and again, adjusting for every variable he could imagine. And every single simulation told him the same thing: humanity should have surrendered by now. Their industrial base was a fraction of the Concord's power, and their technology was centuries behind, and their casualties numbered in the billions. And by every rational measure, they had already lost. But the humans refused to read the simulations. They refused to accept the logical conclusion that their situation was hopeless. They refused to stop fighting, and they refused to stop dying, and they refused to give the Concord a single moment of peace. And slowly, terribly, the calculation began to understand something that changed. Everything he thought he knew about warfare and conquest and the nature of young species humanity was not fighting to win. Humanity was fighting to teach the galaxy a lesson that even the smallest species could hurt the largest empire, and that even certain defeat could be transformed into endless war. And that lesson, the calculation realized, was far more dangerous than any victory could ever be. 7 years into the war, the cracks in the Concord had become wounds that could no longer be hidden. Elder Vorath of the Thren species sat in the Great Council chamber and listened to the latest reports from the front lines. And everything he heard filled him with a fear he had not felt since his species had been conquered 10,000 years ago. "We have lost 17 supply convoys this month," the military commander reported. And the humans have begun using a new weapon that we cannot defend against. They call it a dirty bomb. And it leaves our captured territories poisoned for generations. Unacceptable, Ambassador Vethkai declared, his crystalline form pulsing with anger. And we must increase our offensive operations and crush them before they can develop more weapons. With respect, Ambassador, the commander replied carefully. We have been trying to crush them for 7 years. And every time we destroy one of their fleets, they build 2 more. And every time we kill one of their soldiers, 10 more volunteer to take their place. The chamber fell silent as the weight of those words settled over the assembled leaders for the first time in 10,000 years. The Concord was facing the possibility that they might not win, far from the council chamber. On a small moon that the Concord used as a transit station, a very different conversation was taking place. A group of Vashti workers, members of a species that had been conquered and enslaved 12 centuries ago, huddled in a storage compartment and watched a smuggled recording that had been passed from hand to hand across 100 light years. The recording showed a human woman standing in the ruins of a destroyed city, surrounded by the bodies of her family and the ashes of her home. They think they have broken us, the woman said, her voice raw with grief but steady with determination. And they think that killing our children will make us surrender. But they do not understand what they have done. She looked directly into the camera, and her eyes burned with something that the Vashti had not seen in 1,000 years. They have reminded us what it means to be human, she said. And being human means that we would rather die on our feet than live on our knees. And we will never stop fighting, and we will never stop resisting. And we will make them pay for every single life they have taken. The recording ended, and the Vashti workers sat in silence for a long moment. I had forgotten, one of them finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, what it felt like to refuse. We all forgot, another replied, because the Concord taught us that resistance was futile, and we believed them. And we raised our children to believe them. But these humans, the first worker said slowly, they looked at the same impossible odds that we faced. And they said no. Something stirred in the hearts of the Vashti that night, something old and dangerous and beautiful. They began to remember when human refugees arrived on Vashti worlds 2 months later, starving and wounded. And still somehow defiant, the Vashti did something they had not done in 1,200 years. They hid them. Then they fed them. Then they armed them. The rebellion spread like fire through dry grass. Jumping from species to species and world to world, the Marani, who had been conquered 8 centuries ago, began sabotaging Concord supply lines and accidentally directing human raiders to vulnerable targets. The Yiliks, a species of engineers who had built the Concord ships for 600 years, started including hidden weaknesses in their designs and passing the information to human intelligence networks. The people of the Singing Stone, who had been the Concord's most loyal servants for 10,000 years, quietly stopped singing the songs of praise that they had been forced to learn and began teaching their children the old songs, the songs of resistance and hope and Defiance. Ambassador Vethkai watched his coalition fracture with growing desperation, and in a moment of weakness, he transmitted a private message to Earth's new Secretary General. Why do you continue? He asked, and for the first time his voice held something other than cold certainty. It held confusion and frustration, and perhaps even a hint of fear. You cannot win this war, he continued. And your species will be exterminated, and everything you have built will be destroyed. And your children will never know that you existed. The response came from Secretary General Diego Reyes, a man who had lost his wife and 3 children in Mumbai, and who had spent 7 years turning his grief into determination. You are probably right, Reyes replied. And we will probably lose, and our species will probably be destroyed. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of 7 years of war and 10 billion casualties and the unbroken spirit of a species that refused to surrender. But before we go, he said, we are going to teach this galaxy something it forgot, that you can be outgunned and still be unbroken. And that fear is a choice, and that some species choose anger instead. Vethkai felt his crystalline form flicker with an emotion he could not name. You are insane, he said. And your species is insane, and everything you have done has been irrational and self-destructive and utterly incomprehensible. Maybe, Reyes replied. But look at what our insanity has accomplished. Your empire is cracking, and your subjects are waking up. And for the first time in 10,000 years, the galaxy is remembering that the Concord can be fought. He leaned forward, and even through the transmission his presence seemed to fill the space. We may die, he said, but we will die having shown every enslaved species in this galaxy the resistance is possible. And that lesson will live long after humanity is gone. And it will destroy your Concord more completely than any weapon we could ever build. The first Concord member species to break ranks was the Thren Elder. Vareth stood before the council and announced that his species was withdrawing from the coalition and declaring neutrality in the conflict with humanity. This is treason, Vethkai hissed. And you will be punished for this betrayal. Voreth looked at him with eyes that had seen 10,000 years of Concord rule. Perhaps, he said, but I would rather face your punishment than continue fighting a war against a species that has reminded me what courage looks like. He turned and walked out of the chamber. And as he left, he began to sing an old song, a forbidden song. A song that his species had not sung since the day they were conquered. It was a song of defiance, and across the galaxy, other voices began to join the chorus. The war ended not with humanity's surrender, but with the Concord's collapse. 15 years of conflict had accomplished what nothing else in galactic history had. Managed to do it had proven to the galaxy that the great and terrible Concord could bleed. Admiral Chun Wei stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance and watched the final Concord fleet retreat from human space. And he felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in 15 years. He felt hope. The old admiral was 78 now, his body scarred and his hair white and his eyes carrying the weight of every soldier he had sent to die. He had started the war with a fleet of converted civilian ships and ended it with an armada that stretched across the solar system, built by a species that had transformed itself into something new and terrible and magnificent. Admiral, his communications officer said, we are receiving a transmission from the Concord flagship. Ambassador Vethkai wishes to discuss terms of surrender. Chen Wei closed his eyes for a moment and thought of all the people who had died to reach this moment, the 40 million souls of Mumbai, the countless soldiers who had given their lives in hopeless battles, the civilians who had starved and suffered and refused to break. Tell him I will receive his transmission, Chan Wei said. But remind him that humanity does not surrender, and humanity does not forget. The negotiations took place on a space station that had been built specifically for this purpose, in a chamber that was carefully designed to favor neither side. Secretary General Maria Santos represented humanity. She was the 4th Secretary General since the war began, and she carried the hopes of 12 billion survivors on her shoulders. Ambassador Vethkai represented what remained of the Concord, and his crystalline form had lost much of its luster over the years of war. We are prepared to offer terms, Vethkai said, his voice flat and empty. And we will recognize human sovereignty over your home system and your established colonies. And we will withdraw our forces from all contested territories. Santos looked at him with eyes that held no warmth and no sympathy. "Those are not terms," she said. "Those are concessions. And they are not enough." She activated a holographic display that showed the current state of the galaxy. "The Concord has lost 7 member species to rebellion," she said. "And 34 client species have declared independence. And your empire is falling apart while we sit here talking." Bethkai's form flickered with frustration. "What do you want?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that might have been desperation. Santos leaned forward, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 15 years of war and 10 billion dead. "We want full sovereignty for every species in this galaxy," she said. "And we want reparations for Mumbai and every other atrocity you have committed. And we want the complete and permanent dissolution of the client species system." Bethkai stared at her in disbelief. "That is impossible," he said. "And those terms would destroy the Concord completely." Santos smiled. And it was not a pleasant smile. "Yes," she said. "They would." The negotiations lasted for 3 months. And in the end, the Concord accepted every single one of humanity's terms. They had no choice. Their empire was crumbling. Their subjects were rebelling. And they no longer had the strength to continue fighting a species that simply refused to stop. The treaty was signed on the 50th anniversary of Mumbai's destruction, and it marked the end of 10,000 years of Concord dominance. Admiral Chen Wei attended the signing ceremony, and afterward he walked alone to a viewing window and looked out at the stars. A young officer approached him hesitantly. "Admiral," she said, "may I ask you something?" Chen Wei nodded without turning around. "Was it worth it?" she asked. "All the death and suffering and sacrifice, was it worth it in the end?" The old admiral was silent for a long moment. "I have asked myself that question every day for 15 years, he finally said, "and I have never found an answer that satisfies me." He turned to face her, and his eyes held a weight that she could not fully comprehend. "But I know this," he said. "We showed the galaxy that even the smallest species can stand against the largest empire. And we showed every enslaved world that resistance is possible. And we showed ourselves that we are capable of more than we ever imagined." He looked back out at the stars. 10 billion humans died in this war," he said. "And every single one of them deserved to live. And I will carry their memory with me until my last breath." He paused. "But because of their sacrifice, 100 billion beings across this galaxy are free today. And that is something that no amount of grief can diminish on Earth." The memorial at Mumbai was finally completed. It was a single pillar of black stone, rising from the glass crater where the city had once stood, and it could be seen from orbit like a finger pointing at the sky. The inscription was simple, carved in every language humanity had ever spoken. They expected us to kneel. We chose to stand. In the decades that followed, Earth became something it had never expected, a beacon of hope for the entire galaxy. Species from across the stars made pilgrimage to the Mumbai Memorial, traveling light years to touch the stone where humanity had made its choice. The Vashti came, and the Marani came, and the people of the Singing Stone came. They came to remember what it felt like to refuse. And they came to honor the species that had reminded them in the great archives of galactic history. Scholars recorded a new entry for the species known as humanity. They were not listed as conquerors, because humanity had never sought to rule others. They were not listed as diplomats, because humanity's message had been delivered in blood and fire. They were not listed as warriors, because the word seemed too small for what they had done. Instead, the entries simply read, "The ones who reminded us we could choose, and across the galaxy, on 1,000 worlds that had once lived in fear, children grew up hearing stories of the humans, the small species with short lives who had looked at an empire of stars and said no." The stories always ended the same way. And what happened then? The children would ask. The galaxy remembered what it meant to be free, their elders would reply. And it was because of the humans who chose defiance when the universe expected fear, and in the darkness between stars, where empires rose and fell like waves upon a shore. Humanity's choice echoed through eternity, a reminder that even in the face of certain destruction, even when all hope seems lost, there is always another option. There is always the choice to stand the end.